But you were able to see JIC assessments if you wanted to see them, the work that they produced on a weekly basis?
If I wanted to, but I didn't sort of go around looking for them. When I talked about close consultation with them, it was, I suppose, during those periods when they were routinely coming to the Prime Minister's meetings. And also, when I know we'll come on to the September 2002 dossier, but obviously that was a period of intense cooperation and consultation with them.
Yes, I mean, if we take that period, we will come back to this in more detail. You told Lord Hutton that on the 12th of September 2002, you attended a meeting. You said this was, I quote, "The meeting was with the Prime Minister, Jonathan Powell, David Manning, myself, the head of the SIS, and a senior SIS officer. The last of these explained that there had been a new source in recent weeks who had given them new information. We were being told this because the information was important, but also it was being emphasized that this was information that could not go into the dossier."
Yeah.
Now, why should the Director of Communications and Strategy have been included in such a sensitive meeting with two senior officers of the SIS when it did not concern information that was publicly usable?
Probably because, the short answer is probably because the Prime Minister wanted me to be, and I suspect that Richard Dearlove may have done as well. I don't know. I mean, I happened to be at a lot of the Prime Minister's meetings, but at that time, the heads of the intelligence agencies, I suppose, were spending more time in Downing Street than they normally might, and I happened to be there. I was also at that time, as that entry makes clear, involved in the process of the production of the September dossier.
I mean, when I worked in government, there used to be something called the need to know principle to protect very highly classified information. Was this information that you in your job needed to know?
No, no,
it wasn't. And wouldn't it have been...
It was nonetheless helpful in where I was at that time, with the work that was going on with the dossier that was being published. It was actually quite helpful to know. Did I need to know it in terms of my job preparing the dossier? No.
Wouldn't it have been more normal for SIS to have conveyed this very sensitive information through the chairman of the JIC to number 10 Downing Street?
That may well have already have happened, I don't know. But,
well, why would they have needed to see the Prime Minister if it had happened already?
Well, the Prime Minister may be wanting to take his own judgment, or it may be that Richard Dearlove just decided Richard Dearlove is very, very senior figure within the intelligence services. Clearly, if he wanted access to the Prime Minister, he could have it.
And he saw him quite frequently?
I'd say he saw him fairly frequently, yeah.
Yes. Why was Sir John Scarlett not at that meeting, the JIC chairman?
I don't know that he wasn't.
You didn't list him.
Well, that is true, but
Yes.
that is a diary scribbled together. I'm not saying that he was, I'm not saying that he wasn't. I'm simply saying that as far as my recollection goes, I do remember the meeting. I remember that Richard Dearlove was accompanied by this other person who explained what did appear to be quite significant intelligence to the Prime Minister, but equally it was to inform him rather than to, as it were, tell him anything that was then going to be divulged in public.
Are you aware of any precedent for somebody who'd been the Prime Minister's press secretary, was now the Director of Communications, to have the level of access that you had to, of which this is just one example, to and the direct relationship with the intelligence agencies?
It's not for me to, you'd have to ask the people, my predecessors in the job. What Bernard Ingham's relations were with the intelligence agencies, or Joe Haynes, or anybody else, I don't know. It's not for me to know, it's for them to know.
But you're not aware of any precedent?
I'm not aware, and I'm not unaware of any precedent. I'd be very surprised if the people in my job at some point did not meet people from the intelligence services. And I'll go back to the point I made earlier, that I felt the intelligence services did understand that in these really complicated international situations, communications and an assessment of communications was an important part of what they were doing, as well as what we were doing in Downing Street.
But essentially the role that you were playing as Director of Communications and Strategy was not really one that had existed in that form before. It was new, perhaps for the reasons you've already given. And so you, as one of the 2 or 3 closest advisors to the Prime Minister, were playing a much wider and more sensitive role at the heart of government.
I think that's probably true. Look, I have no experience of another government other than covering it as a journalist and watching it from...
Well, you watched it fairly closely, presumably, as political editor.
Yeah, and I watched it fairly closely as well when we were in opposition, but I have no direct experience of how, other than reading books, of how other people have operated.
But your role was very central. Anything important that was happening at the centre of government, you would basically have known about and probably have been involved in.
I'd have certainly been involved in discussions about it, not least because anything that of that level is likely at some point to have contact with the public domain.
Okay.
And that was part of my job, was to make sure that the government's position on any given issue at any given time was being put across properly to the public.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I think this makes it easier for us now to go into some of the specific areas of policy that you would have been having these discussions about. And perhaps I should at this point hand on to my colleague.
Just before Baroness Bouchard takes up the questioning, do other colleagues want to raise anything on what's been said so far? No?
Chairman, actually, could I raise a question, which was, you haven't mentioned the involvement of the Cabinet Secretary at any of these meetings. What was his involvement, if any, at any of these crucial meetings?
No, I think he was involved in all sorts of meetings, and certainly once they got onto because what tended to happen was a group that comprised Jack Straw, Jeff Hoon, CDS, John Scarlett, would see the Prime Minister prior then to a broader ministerial group, which the Cabinet Secretary almost certainly would be present. And also, don't forget, the Cabinet, I mean, as Sir Roderick knows, the Cabinet Secretary is in and out of Downing Street the whole time.
Thank you. Now, I want to really move on to the period as to build up to the dossier. As we've heard from other witnesses, that after 9/11 and the axis of evil speech and the prospect of US-led military action to effect regime change in Iraq loomed larger than ever. And Sir Christopher Mayor told us that he received new instructions from Downing Street in March 2002, and that when the PM and the President met at Crawford in April, they weren't there to talk about containment or sharpening sanctions, he said. Did you agree with the Prime Minister's views on regime change?
Sorry, what were you saying that Christopher Mayor said?
Christopher Mayor said...
I read his evidence, but I just want to be clear what you're saying he said.
They weren't there to talk about containment or sharpening sanctions.
I thought in several respects Christopher Mayor's evidence didn't actually portray an accurate picture of Crawford at all, nor indeed of the speech that followed.
That aside, but I would like to say that did you agree with the Prime Minister's views on regime change?
Well, if you're saying to me, do I agree with Christopher Mayor's analysis that at Crawford the Prime Minister shifted his position from one of containment to containment and disarmament through the United Nations to one of regime change, then I don't accept that analysis at all.